Hello everyone, this video is a critique of the book Guns, Germs and Steel by Jared Diamond. The book primarily argues for a theory of history, but it deals with many different academic disciplines. To people who aren't intimately familiar with one or more of those disciplines, and the specific topics that the book deals with no less, that is to say the vast majority of people, it provides a nice, neat little narrative that explains how the modern world came to be as it is today. That the peoples of the world developed differently not due to biological differences, but rather environmental and geographical ones, thus explaining why Europeans were the ones who colonized and imperialized large parts of the world. And Diamond states in his intro that he was specifically setting out to avoid the racism that's common in such theories, so all around things seem very good. But as someone with a background in history, it's very easy for me to spot glaring holes that may not be so evident to others. The first and clearest potential issue is that Diamond's theory isn't new. It's called environmental determinism. The idea that people simply develop as their environment dictates. Not simply that the environment just has some sort of effect, but rather that it's the only thing that really matters in the end. This was very popular a couple hundred years ago, where it was used to justify colonialism. Because if people were supposedly primitive due to their environment, then it would be to their benefit if others who were fortunate enough to be from a superior environment came and forced upon them their more civilized ways. Whether the supposed superiority is explained as being biological or environmental, the ultimate assumption is still that Europeans are superior, and so it was pretty much just used in the same way. But Diamond's theory, despite being similar in its explanation, has a completely different goal: to provide a non-racist grand theory of history. So let's see if he succeeds in doing so. I'm going to look at chapter 3 of his book, titled Collision at Cajamarca, which is crucial to establishing his premise. In it, he argues that the Spanish conquest of the Incas and the Aztecs were the result of superior military technology, and that this was also true across the Americas. The rest of the book relies on this chapter having shown this, as it then moves on to explaining why it was the Europeans who had such technology to wage war with in the first place, and why they brought with them the diseases that ravaged the native population. Though in this chapter, disease is only touched on briefly. So, if this chapter is inaccurate, then the book would be arguing for a premise that it hasn't properly established. It might explain why Europeans had the guns, germs, and steel. I'm not commenting on the validity of that part either way, but it would have failed to have demonstrated that those were the reasons why they came to colonize large parts of the world. The reason why I'm dealing with just one chapter is because, most importantly, I don't want to make a 15-hour-long video, but also that I'm not particularly qualified to deal with the non-history parts of the book, that if his historical practices are poor, then it would be fair to be suspicious of the many other parts of the book that are also outside of his field of expertise, and that, as I said, the entire premise of the book relies on it. As for the rest of the book, at the end of the video I'll recommend some further critiques on its wider problems, especially covering the parts of it that I'm not knowledgeable in. And just before beginning, I'm not assuming here that steel weapons and armor aren't technological leaps from padded armor and stone or glass weapons. At no point in this video am I making that argument. The question is not so simply of whether they were better, it's of whether, even assuming that they are far better, that they enabled the feats that Diamond claims they did, and thus can be so simply credited for the conquest. Okay, so let's get started. Diamond begins the chapter with the story of the capture of the Incan emperor, Atahuallpa, by Francisco Pizarro, claiming, "The most dramatic moment in subsequent European-Native American relations was the first encounter between the Inca emperor, Atahuallpa, and the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro at the Peruvian highland town of Cajamarca on November 16, 1532. Atahuallpa was absolute monarch of the largest and most advanced state in the New World, while Pizarro represented the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, also known as King Charles I of Spain, monarch of the most powerful state in Europe. A few sentences later, he also says, Atahuallpa was revered by the Incas as a sun god and exercised absolute authority over his subjects. And later in the chapter he writes, since the Inca bureaucracy was so strongly identified with its godlike absolute monarch, it disintegrated after Atahuallpa's death. So basically the same idea restated again, and he also restates it a few other times in the chapter. But Atahuallpa did not so simply exercise absolute authority, as the fact mentioned in Diamond's first paragraph that he was recently victorious in a war with other Indians hints at. The circumstances of his ascension were highly controversial in the Incan Empire. His brother Huascar had been named as heir by his father, Huayna Capac, as he was dying, probably of smallpox. Huascar was young and inexperienced, and so his brother Atahuallpa was persuaded by army officers to lay a claim to the throne himself, sparking the civil war that had just recently ended when Pizarro arrived. There surely would have been much resentment among the Incas and especially the nobility on the losing side. The Incan Empire was also absolutely massive and full of many subjugated peoples, and they certainly weren't totally loyal to the emperor regardless of who it was. But the way that Diamond describes it in the opening, there's none of this nuance. Everyone is simply ready to obey his every command without thought nor question, and so the second that the emperor was lost, everything just sort of immediately collapsed. But it wasn't like that at all. They were already greatly divided not only by the civil war, but also by an ongoing restructuring process that had been stripping power from regional chiefs who very much resented that. Those chiefs, for example, would have been very happy with the fall of the Incan Empire, as its end allowed them to assert personal control over their regions and regain the power that they'd been stripped of. It's not that the empire was simply totally obedient towards its sun god, and so it collapsed the second that he was gone. Yet throughout the chapter, Diamond frames it as such. He makes it sound like there was nothing more at play, that the Incans were just too reliant on their dear leader and that's it. This is just one of the many ways in this chapter in which Diamond portrays native peoples in a very reductive and simplistic way. After this, Diamond recounts the capture of Atahuallpa by Pizarro and his men, or rather, he uncritically quotes the conquistadors themselves for about 8 pages straight, without a single interjection. The first time I read this, I was kind of in awe, because the conquistadors are known to be very unreliable sources. It's one thing to quote them with caveats, it's another to not just take their accounts entirely at face value, but also to present them as factual to the reader. And Diamond does the latter, not just here, but also throughout this entire chapter. The conquistadors wrote with 2 purposes in mind. One of these was to inform the Spanish monarchy of what had happened. The other, as Matthew Restall describes in his book, 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, was to petition for rewards in the form of offices, titles, and pensions. The very nature and purpose of these documents obliged those who wrote them to promote their own deeds and downplay or ignore those of others, to eliminate process and pattern in favor of individual action or achievement. Most conquest mythology can be found in these reports. The Spaniards as superior beings blessed by divine providence, the invisibility of Africans and native allies, the conquest's rapid rush to completion, and above all, the conquest as the accomplishment of bold and self-sacrificing individuals. So, to take them at their word, that they totally, 100%, took out thousands of enemies while outnumbered 100 to 1, is about akin to you believing me when I tell you that my dad works at Nintendo. They were lying and embellishing their contributions as much as possible, while erasing those of others, particularly native allies, in the hope of receiving greater rewards. Diamond nonetheless takes their word as simple fact multiple times throughout this chapter, furthering those same myths that Restall mentions. In this specific case though, there is some truth to it. If we look beyond the conquistadors' claim that they totally would have killed 40,000 native soldiers if they'd only had the chance. To give you some context before we get into Diamond's own retelling, here's John H. Rowe summarizing the modern understanding of the event. Pizarro did not go to Cajamarca to fight the Inca army, but rather to kidnap Atahuallpa, a plan inspired by the successive tactics used by Cortés in Mexico. Pizarro laid an ambush on the occasion of his first meeting with the Inca ruler on November 15, 1532. Atahuallpa entered Cajamarca for this meeting accompanied by a large retinue. Pizarro kept his men concealed in the buildings surrounding the plaza, while a priest invited the Inca to come and dine with the Spanish commander. Atahuallpa refused, demanding that the Spaniards give up all the booty that they had taken. Thereupon, the Spaniards erupted from their places of concealment. Pizarro, leading a party of men on foot, rushed Atahuallpa's litter and dragged him out of it, while the Spanish horsemen charged into the ranks of his attendants. The surprise was complete. The attendants panicked and tried to flee. There was no combat. Francisco de Jerez wrote afterward, "In all of this, no Indian raised a weapon against the Spaniard. The Spanish horsemen amused themselves by killing hundreds of unresisting fugitives. The conquistadors swore that they killed 7,000, which Diamond quotes without comment. That's obviously a ludicrous number, as even if that many Incans were actually there, 62 men on horses and 100 more on foot simply could never have chased that many people down. The hundreds, mentioned by Rowe, is a much more likely figure." How does Jared Diamond recount this? Well, he is 2 times in the chapter where he gives us his summary. When Pizarro and Atahuallpa met at Cajamarca, Pizarro captured Atahuallpa and killed many of his followers. He had only 62 soldiers mounted on horses, along with 106 foot soldiers, while Atahuallpa commanded an army of about 80,000. And another time, today it is hard for us to grasp the enormous numerical odds against which the Spaniards' military equipment prevailed. At the Battle of Cajamarca recounted above, 168 Spaniards crushed a Native American army 500 times more numerous, killing thousands of natives while not losing a single Spaniard. The problem with this is that there wasn't a battle, and the bit that John Rowe quoted to demonstrate this is actually quoted in the passage that Diamond himself quoted. Not one Indian raised a weapon against a Spaniard on page 73. Yet throughout this chapter, Diamond asserts over and over again that a force of 168 men really did win a battle against 80,000, even as the primary source that he takes at face value contradicts him. I mean, he says they crushed an army 500 times more numerous, but that army wasn't even there. It was camped miles away from the city itself. Those who Pizarro and his men killed were unarmed retainers, who perhaps numbered 1 or 2,000 at most, none of whom tried to fight back. What he said literally just didn't happen. But the idea that this event in particular was a crushing victory in battle is the basis of this entire chapter. He then goes on to ask the question, why did Pizarro capture Atahuallpa? His answer, military technology. Pizarro's military advantages lay in the Spaniards' steel swords and other weapons, steel armor, guns, and horses. To those weapons, Atahuallpa's troops, without animals on which to ride into battle, could only oppose stone, bronze, or wooden clubs, plus slingshots and quilted armor. When I read this the first time, I laughed out loud. It's just so stupid when you know what actually happened. I mean, sure, maybe their steel swords and horses helped them kill some more fleeing, unarmored Incas, but I don't think that's why they managed to do it. If they had no horses, bronze maces, slingshots, and quilted armor, I think they still would have been able to pull it off. After all, Pizarro was commanding the men on foot, and the men on foot are the ones who captured Atahuallpa. What really happened is that they gambled, going for an audacious ambush, and it worked not because they had superior technology, but because their opponents were unarmed. Something that they couldn't have predicted. Diamond has created a battle that never happened, where 168 Spaniards used their superior technology to crush 80,000 troops without losing a single man. Why? Well, I don't know, honestly. I mean, I don't agree with his overall thesis or anything, but there still must have been a much better example somewhere to use to try and establish his premise, because this just isn't it. Maybe he thought that the numbers, 168 against 80,000, looked the most impressive, so he just decided to roll with it and hope the reader knows nothing about the event, and that they aren't attentive enough to read the bits in his own source that make it clear that no one fought back, and that the actual army wasn't there? Or he just somehow didn't catch any of this during his research into the event which he based an entire chapter on? Which I don't think would be possible. Either way, kinda weird. So, Diamond continues. Time and again. Accounts of Pizarro's subsequent battles with the Incas, Cortés's conquest of the Aztecs, and other early European campaigns against Native Americans describe encounters in which a few dozen European horsemen routed thousands of Indians with great slaughter. Yup, their accounts do describe that. And as we established, they were greatly embellishing. They lied about the numbers of enemies, about their personal deeds, erased all of their native allies, etc., because they had incentives to do so. Jared Diamond, though, well, he's just happy to take those accounts at their word. Whenever he's talking about a battle, he's paraphrasing the words of a conquistador, presenting them as superhuman gods thanks to their incredible steel gear. This is just awful history. During Pizarro's march from Cajamarca to the Inca capital of Cusco after Atahuallpa's death, there were 4 such battles: at Huahua, Vilcachua, Vilcaconga, and Cusco. Those 4 battles involved a mere 80, 30, 110, and 40 Spanish horsemen respectively, in each case ranged against thousands or tens of thousands of Indians. Let's take a look at these battles. Luckily for us, Rowe covers all of them. The Spaniards set out for Cusco with their new allies in Chalcuchima. So as you can see, the Spanish already had native allies even before they had left Cajamarca. Another source provides us with a map that shows just how many native allies they already had at this early point. 2,500 from Cajamarca, and along the way they picked up more. By the time they arrived at Cusco, they had almost 10,000. So these battles were hardly just 100 Spaniards routing thousands of Incans. Rowe continues. There were 2 encounters near Jauja, another at Vilcas, and the last and most serious on the climb to the Vilcacunca Pass, only 2 days' march from Cusco. In the first action near Jauja, mounted Spaniards scattered a group of Inca warriors who were marching on level ground. In the second, Pizarro ordered 80 of his horsemen to try and get ahead of the Inca army and stop it. The Spaniards failed to do so, managing only to cut up the Inca rear guard and take some plunder. Pizarro was not pleased. The second encounter seems to be the one that Diamond was referring to, and it doesn't sound like them routing thousands of Indians with great slaughter. We also don't know just how many people they actually fought there with their 2,500 native allies. According to Diamond though, it was thousands or even tens of thousands. Okay, on to Vilcas. At Vilcas, a Spanish advance party of 40 horsemen surprised the Inca camp when most of the fighting men were away on a hunt. The Spaniards took the Inca service personnel prisoner. When the Inca warriors returned from their hunt, there was a fight in which, for the first time, the Incas killed a horse. The next day, the Incas attacked again, carrying the horse's tail as a standard. There was heavy fighting until the Spaniards let their prisoners go. Thereupon, the Incas retired and resumed their march. So, at Vilcas, the Spanish succeeded in taking prisoners from an undefended camp. Then the next day, after fighting, they ended up having to give up the prisoners, and both sides went on their way. Again, this doesn't seem to be at all what Diamond described it to be. It seems like a failure actually. So what about Vilcacunca? The Spanish advance party was almost annihilated on the climb to Vilcacunca Pass. The slope was so steep and the drop so sheer that the riders had dismounted and were leading their horses. When the Incas attacked, the Spaniards lost 5 dead and 17 wounded of their total of 40 men. The rest were saved by darkness. In the night, a party of Spanish reinforcements arrived and the Incas withdrew. The Spanish survivors stayed where they were for 4 days until Pizarro and the rest arrived. The Inca army did succeed in joining the army that controlled Cusco. Again, this does not sound at all to be what Diamond described it to be. The Spanish were almost annihilated actually. What about Cusco? Well, Quizquiz, the Incan commander, tried to stop the Spaniards from entering Cusco. There was an indecisive encounter, from which the Spaniards withdrew to a flat place to spend the night, while Quizquiz's forces camped on a hillside not far off. After dark, there was a disturbance in the Spanish camp caused by some horses breaking loose. Quizquiz's men feared a night attack and withdrew, leaving the way to Cusco open. Manco and Pizarro entered the city as liberators. This single attempt to block the Spanish advance was the only effort Quizquiz made to fight them. Later, when Manco and Pizarro sent their forces to attack him, Quizquiz withdrew and marched away to Quito. Quizquiz was a commander from the Atahuallpa faction, while Manco was chosen by Huáscar's side as their new emperor. As you can see, there was one battle which was indecisive, and then Manco and Pizarro marched together into Cusco unopposed. The last sentence also reveals that they were fighting together. It was not just Spaniards alone. So again, not not really a battle there at all. Just a skirmish and then the Incans withdrew, notably also from a substantial amount of native allies. Where did Diamond get the idea that 100 Spanish horsemen crushed thousands of Incan soldiers in these battles? Well, I don't know, but it's certainly not what actually happened. So, Diamond continues. These Spanish victories cannot be written off as due merely to the help of Native American allies. They can scarcely be called victories at all, but anyway. Here Diamond makes it clear that he's aware of the dominant explanation among historians for Spanish military successes in the early colonization of the Americas. The fact that they had many native allies who often outnumbered them by anywhere from 10 to 500 to 1. This greatly contradicts his argument, so it's very important that he provides a real refutation of it, certainly more than just a sentence or two. But he doesn't, he just hand waves it away. The erasure of the native allies, who usually far outnumbered Spanish soldiers, is such a common old trope that in the aforementioned book, 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, a whole chapter is dedicated to it, along with the erasure of African conquistadors. I particularly like this paragraph for how well it describes Diamond's recounting of events. The image is a familiar one. Thousands of native warriors swarm like bees upon the vastly outnumbered conquistadors, who against all odds fend them off and survive to fight another day. This familiarity is rooted in part in the larger context of the Western colonial experience, whose mythology is punctuated by tales of barbarian hordes miraculously repulsed or crushed. The capture of Atahuallpa, the siege of Vienna, the Alamo, Custer's last stand, Rorke's drift. But the image is also familiar specifically with respect to the Spanish conquest. This image tells us much about the Spaniards, but it leaves out critical aspects of the story. There is no doubt that the Spaniards were consistently outnumbered by native enemies on the battlefield, but what has so often been ignored or forgotten is the fact that Spaniards tended also to be outnumbered by their own native allies. Yep, that sounds like this chapter alright. So, back to Guns, Germs and Steel. Diamond continues, nor can it be attributed to the psychological novelty of Spanish weapons and horses, or, as is often claimed, to the Incas mistaking Spaniards for their returning god, Viracocha. The initial successes of both Pizarro and Cortés did attract native allies. However, many of them would not have become allies if they had not already been persuaded by earlier devastating successes of unassisted Spaniards that resistance was futile and that they should side with the likely winners. Actually, Pizarro and his men had secured many allies before ever even having fought an actual battle, when the only engagement up until that point had been the capture of Atahuallpa. As noted earlier, they gained enough allies in that period that 2,500 Incan troops initially accompanied them when they left Cajamarca for Cusco. Atahuallpa had many enemies who were all too happy to join forces with his captors. Diamond is unwilling to accept simple explanations, but his own explanation is the simplest of them all, that Incans just decided that their technology was impossible to resist, and that's why they joined up with the Spanish. Yet many allied with them before ever even seeing that technology in action. So, what then? Rather than look into the already established explanations, he just baselessly speculates and leaves it at that. I'll present 2 much more detailed explanations. First, from Rowe, the establishment of Spanish dominion in Peru was then a consequence of the Inca Civil War. What made it possible was the desperate need of Huáscar's party, defeated in the Civil War and persecuted by a victorious Atahuallpa. Spanish dominion was established not by military victories, but by an alliance with the faction that had lost the war, an alliance cemented by the 2 political killings, those of Atahuallpa and Chalcuchima, that destroyed the leadership of the party that had won. The Spaniards demanded, and got, submission to the Spanish crown as the price of this alliance. And another from Jeremy Mikecz, whose name I surely just butchered. The Spaniards did not commence their journey south until being invited and until safe passage was assured. After the execution of Atahuallpa, many native delegations arrived in Cajamarca, allegedly to offer their services to Pizarro. We know from one indigenous source, for example, that the leader of the Huancas provided large quantities of goods and hundreds of indigenous auxiliaries to Francisco Pizarro at Cajamarca and essentially invited Pizarro to come down to the Huancas Inca capital of Huajuapan. Thus, Pizarro and his men were not so much an invading force as invited guests. The Incans did pledge allegiance to the Spanish crown, but considering that Manco Inca, who that helped install as the new emperor, rebelled just 2 years later, they clearly didn't plan for this to remain the case for long. For Huáscar's faction, the alliance with the Spanish, who had gained a lot of clout and bargaining power through their capture of Atahuallpa, was their path back into power after being crushed militarily by Atahuallpa. Rather than deciding that resistance was futile, they thought that they were using the Spanish for their own ends just as the Spanish were using them. They clearly didn't think that resistance was futile, because they then resisted as soon as they got the chance. So, the notion that they were swayed by the steel swords and horses of Pizarro and his men is ridiculous and infantilizing. That's pretty much what the conquistadors themselves said happened, except for them it was because of their incredible battle prowess rather than their gear. Attributing it to technology instead still means taking them on their word that they really did what they said and that they did it all themselves. Diamond may have set out to write a non-racist theory, as he states multiple times in the book, but in this chapter he's reinforcing the tropes of the conquest as they were retold for centuries by people looking to glorify it. He continues, within half a dozen years of the initial conquest, Incas mounted 2 desperate, large-scale, well-prepared rebellions against the Spaniards. All of those efforts failed because of the Spaniards' far superior armament. That's simple, that's the only reason. Okay, well let's look at these rebellions. The first, in 1536, was primarily fought as a 10-month-long siege of Cusco, which was held by the Spanish, and about 30,000 allied native soldiers. This was not a military victory thanks to the use of superior weapons. Rather, the besiegers were mostly not professional soldiers. They were drawn from the general population, which included entire families who lived there while the men fought. Most of them simply wanted to return to their lives, especially since the Spanish were executing captured women and children, which greatly demoralized them. So, after a long, inconclusive back and forth, they withdrew without being defeated militarily. Actually, the Spanish and their allies lost the last pitched battle of the conflict, the Battle of Ollantaytambo. Manco Inca then formed a competing Inca state that lasted until 1571. I'm not sure how that's so simply failing due to the Spaniards' far superior armament, especially since by far the majority of combatants on the Spanish side were themselves Incans anyway. The next rebellion, in 1538, was a minor affair in comparison, involving smaller scale warfare in which, again, the Spaniards were usually outnumbered by native allies, and their opponents were fewer in number and far more fragmented. Diamond seems to have simply taken the fact that there were 2 rebellions, and then just decided that the reason that they failed was due to the superior weaponry of the Spanish, without looking into them at all. He continues, by the time of the Great Inca Rebellion of 1536, the Incas had learned how best to defend themselves against cavalry by ambushing and annihilating Spanish horsemen in narrow passes. But the Incas, like all other foot soldiers, were never able to defeat cavalry in the open. When Quiso Yupanqui, the best general of the Inca Emperor Manco, who succeeded Atahuallpa, besieged the Spanish in Lima in 1536 and tried to storm the city, 2 squadrons of Spanish cavalry charged a much larger Indian force on flat ground, killed Quiso and all of his commanders in the first charge, and routed his army. A similar cavalry charge of 26 horsemen routed the best troops of Emperor Manco himself as he was besieging the Spaniards in Cusco. Here, Diamond finally manages to characterize an engagement remotely accurately. The cavalry charge mentioned during the siege of Lima was indeed effective, but it didn't so simply rout a much bigger army. Here's an account that accurately summarizes conquistador sources on the event. General Quiso crossed both branches of the Rimac River in his litter. Seeing that the enemy warriors were starting to enter the streets of the city and some of Quiso's men were moving along the tops of the walls, the Spanish cavalry charged and attacked with such great determination that, since the ground was flat, they routed them instantly. The General Quiso was there dead, and so were 40 commanders and other chiefs alongside him. Although it seemed as if our men had specifically selected them, they were killed because they were marching at the head of their men, and thus they were the first the Spaniards smashed into. So they didn't take out the army, rather a part of the vanguard, killing about 40 people, which was less than their own number. The important part about this is who they killed. Basically all of the army's commanders. The army itself didn't immediately rout. Rather, left without leadership, they abandoned the battlefield the next day. What caused this more? The tactical error of having all of your most important leaders in the vanguard, storming the city far ahead of everyone else, or the incredible charge of the superhuman Spanish cavalry alone? I'd say the first is by far the most important thing. If 40 regular soldiers had instead been killed in the vanguard, the Spanish may not have lived to tell the tale. Also, the Spanish were outnumbered 50-1 by their native allies in this battle. In total, they actually might have even outnumbered the attacking force. So while the circumstances did make this cavalry charge very effective, and it did indeed lead to the dissolution of the attacking army the next day, they didn't so simply take on an entire army themselves, as Diamond's account might lead people to believe. They took on a small vanguard force, which by coincidence happened to be full of commanders. And the only reason that they were even able to hold out until that point is because they had 50,000 more native soldiers on their side. The second charge that Diamond mentions of 26 horses during the siege of Cusco was also attested to by conquistadors. How much you want to believe it depends on how much you want to take them at their word, as Diamond does constantly. Either way, even if we accept that it really happened exactly as described, we're talking one small engagement in a 10-month-long siege where the Spanish fought alongside 30,000 native allies. During that siege, Manco Inca's forces won multiple battles against the Spanish when they won alongside their much more numerous native allies, such as in one instance where 150 Spaniards were wiped out, another battle where more than 30 men were killed, another where 80 horsemen were lost, and another where 30 Spanish were surrounded and slaughtered. In all of those cases, they had their steel armor, their swords, and their horses. Yet things didn't go nearly as well. Indeed, during one period of the siege of Cusco, where some native troops were deserting and a Spanish defeat looked imminent, Pizarro wrote, "The Inca has Cusco besieged, and for 5 months I have heard nothing. The country is so badly damaged that no native chiefs now serve us, and they have won many victories against us. It causes me such great sorrow that it is consuming my entire life." In their weakest moments, even the conquistadors were capable of being honest about their reliance on native troops, more than we can say for Jared Diamond, who seems to earnestly believe that a few dozen Spaniards beat forces of tens of thousands countless times. The common difference between victory and defeat during the Spanish conquest of the Incas and Aztecs was not steel weapons or horses, but rather large numbers of native allies. Without them, they consistently failed. They had those same horses and weapons during the many losses too, and there were many more aside from the few that I just mentioned. We simply don't hear about them very often because it's the successes that get famous. For example, before Cortés, there was an expedition into Mayan territory that was quickly crushed in battle. And before Pizarro in the Incan Empire, there was Alex Garcia, a Portuguese conquistador who was the first known European to set foot there. He looted some towns and then fled when the army showed up. The primary difference between those guys and Pizarro and Cortés is that the latter two quickly sought out and secured alliances with native peoples with whom they shared common enemies. And that latter bit was very important, because Garcia, for example, did have native allies, but they weren't people who had any stake with the Incans, and so they quickly betrayed and killed him. The same thing that Pizarro's allies could have done to him at pretty much any moment. But they didn't, because they had a common enemy. Another interesting anecdote is that the first attempt at European settlement in Buenos Aires was driven out by constant attacks from indigenous people. Was that because the indigenous people had superior technology? We're biased towards the successes, so we don't even ask those questions. There's simply way too many exceptions for Diamond's explanation to be a rule. Look, I personally think that steel swords, Armor and horses were probably very useful and better than what the Incas and Aztecs were using, but not so much so that 168 guys could legitimately beat an army of 80,000, or any of the other scenarios that Diamond presents multiple times throughout this chapter. In the face of, say, 30,000 native allies, 100 Spaniards were definitely not remotely the primary actors, and any time where a conquistador source asserts otherwise, well, they're plainly bullshitting. So, was technology useful to the Spanish conquest? Yeah, sure. As it would be in any military venture. Was it the reason, as Diamond asserts? Absolutely not. Not even close. There was a complex array of factors, chief among them alliances with native polities and a whole lot of dumb luck. Horses and steel swords are very far down the list. But Diamond wanted to reduce it so simply to military technology, and so he straight up invented a series of battles where it won the day all by itself. Once guns got better and more common further down the line, technology certainly did become a lot more decisive, but colonialism of the Americas began long beforehand, so that's hardly enough to explain it. Before I move on to the next part of the chapter, here's Diamond's last, nauseating mention of his straight-up invented Battle of Cajamarca. The role of cavalry at Cajamarca thus exemplifies a military weapon that remained potent for 6,000 years. And he again reiterates that he does, indeed, like to take conquistador stories that erase their tens of thousands of native allies at face value. When we consider the advantages that Spaniards derived from horses, steel weapons and armor against foot soldiers without metal, it should no longer surprise us that Spaniards consistently won battles against enormous odds. As we've established, they just didn't, and the odds were actually mostly very even and sometimes even in their favor. Anyway, next he moves on from military technology. How did Atahuallpa come to be at Cajamarca? Atahuallpa and his army came to be at Cajamarca because they had just won decisive battles in a civil war that left the Incas divided and vulnerable. Pizarro quickly appreciated those divisions and exploited them. The reason for the civil war was that an epidemic of smallpox, spreading overland among South American Indians after its arrival with Spanish settlers in Panama and Colombia, had killed the Inca emperor Huayna Capac and most of his court around 1526, and then immediately killed his designated heir, Ninancoyuchi. Those deaths precipitated a contest for the throne between Atahuallpa and his half-brother Huáscar. If it had not been for the epidemic, the Spaniards would have faced a united empire. Atahuallpa's presence at Cajamarca thus highlights one of the key factors in world history: diseases transmitted to people lacking immunity by invading people with considerable immunity. It is widely theorized that Huayna Capac died from smallpox. Assuming that he did, it was total chance. He just as easily might not have contracted smallpox and survived. Using the death of one specific person as an illustrative example of the role that disease played is tenuous at best. This was just another one of the perfect storm of lucky coincidences that benefited Pizarro. He just as easily might not have died from the epidemic, and what then? From this to the timing of their arrival, before Atahuallpa was able to consolidate his grip over the empire, to Atahuallpa receiving them without any armed guards, to Huáscar's faction being so willing to accommodate them. It's certainly very tempting to try and find some sort of rhyme or reason to what happened, to look for patterns rather than just accepting that they were in the right place at the right time for what they wanted to do, and that they just kind of got really lucky. Beforehand, they had little idea that any of these things would happen, but they took a long odds gamble and it worked out for them in the end. It can't be explained so simply as germs and steel. Diseases were certainly a big factor in colonization as a whole, but a single person's untimely death is not how you demonstrate that. I feel like he just wanted to shoehorn that into the chapter so that he could cover another one of the bases from the title. Next, he moves on to ships. In addition to the ships themselves, Pizarro's presence depended on the centralized political political organization that enabled Spain to finance, build, staff, and equip the ships. The Inca Empire also had a centralized political organization, but that actually worked to its disadvantage, because Pizarro seized the Inca chain of command intact by capturing Atahuallpa. Since the Inca bureaucracy was so strongly identified with its godlike absolute monarch, it disintegrated after Atahuallpa's death. Maritime technology coupled with political organization was similarly essential for European expansions to other continents, as well as for expansions of many other peoples. This bit is just factually wrong. Pizarro's expedition, along with that of Cortés earlier in Central America, was a private endeavor. They were not at all under the command of the Spanish crown, rather they acted first and sought approval later. But anyway, Diamond also notes that the Incas had the same thing that he credits for the Spanish arrival in Peru. But for them, it was actually bad to have it because reasons. So the pattern that he identified is wrong, and he just hand waves it away. It's good to have this thing, but only for the Europeans, not for those natives. The Incans certainly had the political organization necessary to finance and organize large-scale endeavors during the century prior, so Diamond's explanation doesn't really answer the question at all. I'm not sure how someone could read that and think that it did. Diamond ends the chapter by claiming that Europeans having writing while the Incans did not is somehow an explanation for why Atahuallpa walked into Pizarro's trap, even though Pizarro couldn't read, something that he himself acknowledges. It's true that Pizarro copied the tactics used by Cortés in his capture of Montezuma, but he'd obviously heard about them through simple word of mouth, not through reading. The Incans were also capable of orally transmitting information. The way that he puts this certainly brings the book's claims of being anti-racist into question. We find it hard to avoid the conclusion that Atahuallpa should have been more suspicious, if only his society had experienced a broader range of human behavior. Pizarro too arrived at Cajamarca with no information about the Incas other than what he had learned by interrogating the Inca subjects he encountered in 1527 and 1531. However, while Pizarro himself happened to be illiterate, he belonged to a literate tradition. From books, the Spaniards knew of many contemporary civilizations remote from Europe, and about several thousand years of European history. Pizarro explicitly modeled his ambush of Atahuallpa on the successful strategy of Cortés. It's like any generic exaltation of the greatness of Western civilization with all the baggage that brings. Aside from, again, the fact that Cortés couldn't read, there's an implication here that the Incas simply could not have even conceived of the concept of an invasion, or of the idea that others might have dishonest intentions or ambush them because they couldn't read. Are you serious? Much more likely, they simply didn't predict that a small group of completely unknown men would ambush them in such a daring fashion on their first meeting, nor that Huáscar's faction would be so quick to take advantage of the situation. If you simply consider them as equal human beings rather than as naive and childlike, more plausible explanations are very easy to find. Such an error could have been made in any culture. Need I remind you of the global obsession with the assassination of Julius Caesar? Ah well, I guess Caesar was just naive and had yet to experience the full range of human behavior to expect an ambush. Diamond's exaltation of literacy as a further example of European superiority was actually used as a prime example in the aforementioned book, 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest. It does a great job of explaining the problems with this idea, and regardless of Diamond's intentions, he ended up falling in with the same racist ideas of centuries past. It's worth quoting at length. Diamond's assertion is that literacy explains the nature and outcome of the meeting between the Spanish captain and the Inca emperor. Spain possessed it, while the Inca Empire did not. Spanish writing transmitted information that brought Spaniards to Peru in the first place. Writing then gave the invaders a cognitive advantage over Atahuallpa, whose access to scant information thus led him to make naive and fatal miscalculations. There are a number of problems with this argument. First, there is no evidence that Pizarro and his colleagues were any better informed about the Inca Empire and Andean culture than Atahuallpa was of the Spaniards. Both leaders had sent out spies and questioned northern Andean natives before the meeting. Second, it is highly debatable whether writing would have been a better system of communicating information than the oral techniques and quipu devices, complex sets of colored, knotted strings attached to rods, developed over centuries by Andeans. Even if we concede writing to be marginally more efficient, under the specific circumstances of Pizarro's invasion, its possible advantage hardly explains the entire outcome of the conquest of Peru. Third, Diamond's assertion that literacy made the Spaniards heirs to a huge body of knowledge about human behavior and history that was denied to Andeans is a highly problematic generalization that is better explained by the geographic factors articulated by Diamond elsewhere in his book. Fourth, as it is not clear how much or little Atahuallpa knew of Pizarro's expedition, we might accept Diamond's premise, but it is still not at all clear what difference it could have made. The Spaniards, allegedly better informed, followed the predictable patterns of the conquest. During the initial encounter, this included using legalistic measures to validate their actions, the use of display violence, and the capture of the native ruler. In the encounter's immediate aftermath, this included a dependence upon native interpreters, the use of native allies, and the emphasis on acquiring precious metals. It seems unreasonable to deem Atahuallpa naive for not attempting to have the Spaniards all killed before they could get near to him, and unrealistic to expect that any amount of information would have inspired such a brutal and draconian decision. It is doubtful that knowledge of the Mexica Empire and its collapse would have deterred the Inca ruler from engaging, rather than simply slaughtering the invaders. Had the circumstances been reversed, and unknown foreigners landed on Iberian shores, curiosity certainly would have gotten the better of the Spaniards too. Finally, the argument is further undermined by the parallel case of the Cortés-Montezuma encounter. Mesoamericans did have writing, forcing Diamond to dispense with the literacy argument and resort to another myth, that Montezuma miscalculated even more grossly when he took Cortés for a returning god and admitted him and his tiny army into the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Diamond's argument about writing is part of a well-entrenched myth, going back at least to the Middle Ages, and Thomas Aquinas' assertion that alphabetic writing distinguished civilized people from barbarians. Las Casas claimed that Aristotle had made the same distinction. While the Dominican was wrong, his claim illustrates the deep-rooted validity of the distinction in the European mind. In the late 20th century, scholars dedicated to rejecting ethnocentrism were still unable to shake completely the belief that alphabetic writing indicates superiority in some sense. The Pizarro-Atahuallpa encounter is thus an example of how the myth of miscommunication has been perpetrated and used by scholars to explain the conquest in colonialist terms that would have made sense to the conquistadors themselves. Yet the differences between Spanish and Andean communicative technologies do not adequately explain the conquest of Peru. I'm happy to take Diamond at his word, in that he set out to provide an explanation of colonialism that wasn't racist, that had nothing to do with innate biological superiority. And well, this chapter doesn't read much differently than old accounts of the Spanish conquests that embellished and glorified it. It's really just straight out of the 19th century. And that's apart from the fact that, well, a lot of it is also just terrible scholarship, taking primary sources at face value, greatly mischaracterizing events, and spreading myths that were refuted long ago. It's significantly worse scholarship than even my YouTube videos, and I'm just some random idiot. Jared Diamond is supposedly a real academic. Diamond ends the chapter with this: but we are still left with the fundamental question: why all those immediate advantages came to lie more with Europe than with the New World? Why weren't the Incas the ones to invent guns and steel swords, to be mounted on animals as fearsome as horses, to bear diseases to which Europeans lacked resistance, to develop ocean-going ships and advance political organization? I mean, they did that last part, but whatever, dude. And to be able to draw on the experience of thousands of years of written history. Those are no longer the questions of proximate causation that this chapter has been discussing, but questions of ultimate causation that will take up the next two parts of this book. He believes that he's done a good enough job of establishing his premise, but I think I've demonstrated well enough that this chapter did anything but. Now, I'm sure there's already comments saying, okay, but you didn't disprove his overall theory. Well, apart from the fact that he didn't prove it either, you're right. I didn't and I can't, because it's not possible to do so. It's unfalsifiable, impossible to prove or to disprove. It doesn't matter that individual arguments for environmental determinism or other claims that some overarching theory of history are refuted, and it's very easy to refute them because they rely entirely on providing rapid-fire lists of examples, which they always end up mischaracterizing. People can always just say, well, it's just that one argument that was bad. That doesn't mean the conclusions were wrong. Well, the first part of that is somewhat true. Diamond's argument for environmental determinism isn't a very good one. There probably are better arguments out there, but they're always still very easy to poke holes in, and that should, at least, give their proponents a little bit of pause. Diamond was clearly aware of criticisms of environmental determinism before writing his book, because in the intro he mentions them twice. Naturally, the notion that environmental geography and biogeography influence societal development is an old idea. Nowadays, though, the view is not held in esteem by historians. It is considered wrong or simplistic, or it is caricatured as environmental determinism and dismissed, or else the whole subject of trying to understand worldwide differences is shelved as too difficult. And later, but mention of these environmental differences invites among historians the label geographic determinism, which raises hackles. But rather than read up on those critiques and try to understand just why these views aren't held in esteem by historians, he instead presents them as caricatures, ironically while claiming that that's what they're doing. They're ivory tower intellectuals, scoffing at practical men like him who have the real answers. But his own book provides excellent examples of one of the biggest problems with environmental determinism. It has its very origins in the assumption that the so-called West is superior. It always first extols its supposed virtues and uniqueness. Whether you believe that or not yourself, it's clear that operating on that assumption and trying to find evidence for it in everything doesn't really work. It's very bad practice to come to a conclusion first and then work backwards trying to prove it. Diamond shows this perfectly. He ended up ignoring modern historians to instead repeat antiquated myths that hordes of barbarous Incans were incapable of defeating even just 100 Europeans. The fact that it didn't actually happen like that at all can't be allowed to get in the way of his thesis. Writing to conform to a predetermined pattern fosters very, very bad research, and leads to things like Diamond basing his entire chapter around a battle that simply never happened. Another big issue is the way that such theories present the course of history as simply inevitable. The way that Diamond does so as one big environmental and geographical accident encourages people to look at colonization and its many associated atrocities not as injustices but as simple inevitabilities. And so the actions of the many individuals, states, institutions, etc. involved in these enterprises can be easily excused because, you know, they were just gonna happen anyway. No one has any agency, but least of all the naive indigenous people. Myself, well, I would argue that the course of history was not determined by anything in particular, but rather countless different events, all with their own numerous complexities and nuances, that all ended up influencing one another in an endless chain of action until we got to where we are today. Not as tidy and compelling as a nice, simple pattern that explains everything, but also impossible to poke holes in, while pattern-seeking theories of history are just full of them. And I really think that the preoccupation with searching for some broad historical pattern is a very human thing. We want to be able to neatly explain everything. We want to feel like there's some sort of rhyme and reason to everything, but sometimes there just isn't, and you're completely free to believe otherwise. I can't prove you wrong, you can't prove me wrong. All that I can do is point out the flaws in such beliefs, tell you where they come from, and where they might lead. If you want more in-depth criticisms on other parts of the book, I'll be including some suggestions in the description of this video which you can go and take a look at. For further reading on the Spanish conquests of the Incas and Aztecs, I highly suggest a book cited in this very video, 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest by Matthew Restall, which is great for countering the classroom version where the conquistadors are simply taken at their word. Diamond's retelling perpetuates practically all 7 of the mentioned myths, so this book is a great read if you want the opposite perspective. And to learn about the problems with environmental determinism in general, I seriously, unironically suggest the Wikipedia article on the topic, which is actually quite good and easy to understand. I'd also like to acknowledge that I got the idea for this video from an old post on the Bad History subreddit, whose author I unfortunately can't credit, as it seems that they've deleted their account, but thanks to them for putting me on the right track. Anyway, that's about it. Leave your angry comments below. Thank you for watching my video. This stuff takes a lot of work to make, so if you like it, well, you can support me by just kind of watching my stuff. You know, like by subscribing, checking out my other videos, telling your grandma about them, stuff like that. And also check out my second channel on YouTube, Empanada Report, where I post shorter videos. And if you really like them, you could support me on Patreon, become a member on YouTube, or send me a one-time donation on Ko-fi. It all really helps. Thank you all so much. Speaking of thanks, now I'd like to thank all of my patrons, and especially my $25 plus patrons. Fur Tahan, A Big Mean Cat, Tangaparutu Neha, Super Pancake Man, Shub, Jesse Hosik, Pote, and my $10 plus patrons. One Trash Boy, Christoph Kaczynski, Insurgente, Derek, Young Trotsky, Mamushin, Violet Rain, Ritsuki Kazin, Nico Del Sesto, Audrey Nate Fawn, Mubashir Razvi, Diego Asalvati, Industrial Robot, Jet with 2 T's, Christopher Strom, Morimer, Crouton and Baguette, and Cincioni Bresgal. That's all, bye!